How a single complaint shattered my office and made me quit. David sat nervously in the break room of his new job at the large corporate office, clutching his coffee cup tightly. It was his first week, and everything seemed overwhelming. The endless meetings, the awkward interactions with coworkers, and the persistent hum of fluorescent lights above his head. But what really struck him the most was the lack of perks, little things that had once made the company stand out, like the uniforms. He had been told that the company used to provide full uniforms, including boots, hats, shirts, pants, hoodies, winter coats, and even gloves. The thought of being fully outfitted in company gear had made David feel a bit nostalgic, but it was just that, a thought. When he arrived, he discovered that the boots were no longer part of the uniform package. "They don't provide boots anymore," his manager Terry had explained curtly when David asked. "We used to, but some people ruin it for everyone." David was confused. He tried to get more information, but Terry just shook her head, clearly not interested in revisiting the past. It wasn't until later, when David overheard a conversation in the hallway, that he learned the full story. "Did you know they stopped giving out boots?" one of the employees, a woman named Karen, was saying to another coworker. "Yeah, it's because of that one guy from before," the coworker replied. "He kept selling his boots and asking for replacements. Did it at least 20 times before anyone noticed. By the time they caught on, the damage was done. Now, we don't get boots anymore." David was stunned. It was hard to imagine someone repeatedly taking advantage of the system like that. He couldn't help but wonder how something as trivial as a pair of boots could spiral into a company-wide policy change. That afternoon, as David sat in his cubicle, he found himself thinking about it. The boots were just one small part of the larger picture. He had been told that the company used to offer all sorts of perks, work-from-home days, lunch discounts, and even company trips. But one person's actions could destroy all of that. It seemed like a metaphor for the entire workplace. He glanced around, noticing the sterile environment, the dull white walls, and the flickering fluorescent lights. It wasn't the thriving, energetic company he had imagined. The perks that were once taken for granted had been taken away, and all because of a few bad apples. David sighed and turned his attention back to his computer screen. He had been hired for a specific job, and he needed to focus on that. But it was hard to ignore the underlying tension that seemed to permeate the office, a quiet frustration that lingered in the air. He knew it wasn't just the missing boots that bothered him. It was the realization that this was a place where one person's selfishness could ripple out and affect everyone. Charlie was a firefighter. He was the kind of guy who could charm the pants off anyone with a smile and a firm handshake. But Charlie had a problem. He didn't know when to stop. It started innocently enough. There was a BBQ place in town that offered a discount to first responders, $10 off any meal. Or if the meal cost less than $10, the meal was free. It was a small town, and the restaurant loved to support local heroes. Charlie and his fellow firefighters were frequent patrons, and at first, the restaurant owners were happy to see them. But over time, things started to change. Charlie, who had become a regular at the BBQ joint, began pushing the boundaries of the discount. He'd order an $8 meal, and if it cost less than $10, he'd demand the $2 difference in cash. It was small, but it was something. And then, one day, Charlie showed up in uniform on his day off, trying to claim the discount for a meal he didn't deserve. "Charlie, you know the rules," the restaurant manager Mark said, shaking his head. "The discount is for when you're working, not when you're off duty." But Charlie wasn't having it. "Come on, Mark, you know how it is. Just let it slide this time." Charlie's persistence wore on the restaurant, and it wasn't just him. Other firefighters began to follow suit, visiting the restaurant on their days off, dressed in their uniforms to take advantage of the discount. It wasn't long before one of them, a veteran firefighter, hosted a family reunion at the BBQ place. When the manager refused to apply the discount to the entire group, the firefighter made a scene. The restaurant owners, fed up, decided to stop offering the discount altogether. It was a loss for the community, especially the other first responders who had appreciated the gesture. The restaurant was no longer the warm, welcoming place it had been. People began to gossip about how the firefighters had ruined a good thing for everyone. Charlie never understood the consequences of his actions. To him, it was just a few bucks, a small thing. But in the end, his actions had destroyed a cherished tradition for the entire community. Miss Thompson had been teaching at the elementary school for 10 years. She loved her job, loved the kids, and loved taking them on field trips. But there was one trip she would never forget. The zoo trip that ended in disaster. It had been a yearly tradition for the school. The entire class would visit the zoo, see the animals, and learn about wildlife. It was always one of the highlights of the year. But that year, something went horribly wrong. Timmy, a boy in her class, who had always been a bit of a troublemaker, decided to take things too far. During their visit to the penguin enclosure, Timmy did the unthinkable. He jumped over the fence and punched one of the penguins. The other kids screamed in horror as the zookeepers rushed to calm the situation. But it was too late. Timmy's impulsive actions had ruined the trip. The zoo called the police, and Timmy was taken away, though nothing ever came of it. But for Miss Thompson and the school, it was the end of an era. The school district immediately banned any future trips to the zoo, citing safety concerns. Miss Thompson felt personally responsible. She had been the teacher in charge. She had failed to stop Timmy before he did something dangerous, and now the kids would never experience that joy again. Timmy's life took a different turn after the incident. The other kids at school started whispering about him, calling him the penguin puncher. He became a pariah in the school, and despite his attempts to make amends, the damage had been done. The zoo trip was forever canceled, and all because of one impulsive, thoughtless decision. Lisa had always loved the flexibility of working from home. It gave her the freedom to manage her schedule, get things done without the distractions of the office, and most importantly, it allowed her to focus on her tasks. The company had implemented a work-from-home policy 2 days a week, and Lisa made the most of it. But that day, everything changed. Lisa had decided to take advantage of her day off to run some errands. She had planned to be back home in time for a team meeting, but as the time passed, she realized she'd missed it. A phone call from her manager came shortly after. "Lisa, where are you? We had a meeting scheduled, and you didn't show up." Lisa quickly glanced around. Hearing the background noise from the busy store she was in, she knew she had been caught. The manager, suspicious of the noises, asked her outright if she was working. Caught in the lie, Lisa had no choice but to admit that she wasn't working, that she had been out shopping instead. Her manager was furious. The very next day, the company made an announcement. Work-from-home days were over. From now on, everyone was required to come into the office 5 days a week. Lisa's actions had affected the entire company. What had started as a small lie, a harmless break in the routine, had now changed the work culture for everyone. The flexibility that had been such a cherished perk was gone, all because of one employee's failure to take the policy seriously. Private Jeremy sat at the mess hall table, nervously glancing around as he shoveled food into his mouth. Army basic training was tough, and Jeremy, a young recruit, had one goal: to get through it without standing out. But that morning he had a different plan. He had heard rumors from the older soldiers about how some platoons were allowed to eat their meals early if they finished quickly enough. It seemed like an easy way to get a little extra time for himself before the next round of drills started. So, Jeremy decided to put the plan into action. He wolfed down his breakfast in record time, his hands shaking slightly as he grabbed the last few bites of his eggs and toast. Before anyone could even take a second bite, Jeremy stood up, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. He was proud of his accomplishment, but as he turned to leave, he heard a shout from his drill sergeant. "Private Jeremy, where do you think you're going? Sit back down." Confused, Jeremy looked around, realizing that the entire platoon had stopped eating. His actions had set off a chain reaction. The drill sergeant stormed toward him, eyes narrowing. "You just ruined breakfast for everyone, Private." Jeremy felt a knot form in his stomach. His reckless desire to finish early had disrupted the whole platoon. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the team, and Jeremy had failed them. The next day he did it again, this time even faster, hoping to avoid the same fate. But as soon as he stood up, the whole platoon froze, and the sergeant shouted, "No one eats until everyone is done, Private. You are not an exception." This time, the consequences were more severe. After breakfast, Jeremy was assigned extra duties, scrubbing floors, cleaning bathrooms, and more. His bunkmates were annoyed with him. His reputation as a selfish, self-centered soldier spread quickly, and Jeremy knew that from now on, the rules would be enforced. He had learned a hard lesson. The military wasn't about individuals, it was about the collective. His selfishness had cost him respect and the camaraderie that came with being part of a team. Kyle was known for his pranks. He was always the one who managed to find new ways to get under people's skin, always making everyone laugh at the expense of someone else. The Boys and Girls Club after-school program had long been a place for kids to unwind and play games after school. One of the most popular activities was dodgeball. The soft, foam-filled balls were perfect for the kids, and they'd spent hours running around the gym, trying to avoid being hit while aiming for their opponents. But one day, Kyle went too far. He had gotten the idea to sneak a rock into one of the dodgeballs. It wasn't something he'd ever done before, but it felt like a funny idea at the time. No one would expect it, and it would make the game more interesting, right? During the game, Kyle aimed at another kid, Tim, who had been talking trash all afternoon. Kyle threw the ball with all of his might, and it hit Tim square in the chest, knocking him down. But when Tim tried to stand up, he was in pain, serious pain. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a faint cry came out. The other kids rushed over to Tim, and when the ball was picked up, everyone saw the rock inside. Panic spread through the group, and it wasn't long before the adults arrived. Tim was taken to the hospital with 2 broken front teeth, and the game was over for good. The incident became the talk of the entire community. The Boys and Girls Club made a swift decision to stop playing dodgeball, a game that had been a staple for years. It wasn't just about the broken teeth, it was about trust. No one could ever again be sure if the ball was safe. Kyle's actions had ruined the fun for everyone. He never meant to hurt anyone, but that didn't change the fact that he had. The consequences of his prank echoed through the club for months, and soon, dodgeball was banned entirely. Emma had always looked forward to the annual 6th grade ski trip. It was one of those rare events where the whole class came together, bonding over hot cocoa, snowy hills, and the thrill of skiing or tubing down the slopes. Her father, Mr. Daniels, had volunteered as a chaperone, an honor he had earned after years of helping out at school events. Emma was excited to have him there, especially since he had promised to watch her and her friends on the tubing hill. The first few runs went smoothly, but as the day wore on, things took a dangerous turn. Emma, her dad, and 5 of her friends lined up to go tubing down the steepest hill. They were all laughing, excited for their turn. But as they sped down the hill, Emma lost control. The tube went off track, and the group went tumbling into the snow. 2 girls, Sarah and Layla, hit the ground hard. Emma could see them clutching their arms in pain, but she was too stunned to do anything at first. The teachers rushed to the scene, and within minutes, paramedics were on their way. The girls had broken their arms. One of them needed surgery. The news spread fast, and the trip was abruptly cut short. The school decided to cancel all future overnight ski trips. Emma's dad felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Even though he hadn't been the one to cause the accident, he couldn't help but feel that if he had been more careful, this wouldn't have happened. The school community was furious, and Emma overheard her classmates blaming her dad for the accident. The lodge trips were never allowed again, and for years after, Emma and her dad became the target of whispered blame. The school, once a place for adventure and fun, was now haunted by the memory of that fateful day. Clara had always prided herself on being a good nurse. She worked at the local hospital's dialysis center, where the job was demanding, but she loved the work. The team was tight-knit, and they supported each other through long shifts in difficult cases. A few years ago, the hospital had introduced a new shift schedule to help alleviate burnout. The idea was simple: a rotating shift from noon to midnight, with weekends off, giving nurses a much-needed break from the relentless on-call duties. It was supposed to be a solution to the overwhelming demand for dialysis services. But soon, one of the nurses began to abuse the new schedule. Nurse Megan, who was part of the team, started showing up early, leaving before her shift officially ended, and ignoring calls for add-on patients. Clara tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just an occasional slip-up, but as time went on, it became clear that Megan was taking advantage of the situation. When management finally noticed, it was too late. The entire shift system was scrapped, and the hospital returned to the old on-call schedule. No one had weekends off anymore. Everyone had to take turns working late, and the once promising schedule was gone. Clara and her colleagues were furious. They had worked so hard to maintain their schedules, but one person's actions had ruined it for everyone. It was a bitter reminder that when one person took advantage of a system, it could affect the lives of many others. At the corporate office where David had just started working, there was one thing that always made the long hours a bit more bearable: the music. Every day, the HR department played a mix of different genres in the background, from upbeat pop to calming classical music. It wasn't loud, but it was always there, a constant hum that helped drown out the stress of the workday. For months, it had been a small but cherished perk. Employees would occasionally hum along, tap their feet under the desk, or discuss their favorite songs during breaks. But that all changed one fateful day when someone decided to complain. Megan, a quiet woman in the marketing department, was known for her meticulousness, but she was also incredibly particular. It had only been a few weeks since she joined the team, but she quickly became known for her grievances. She didn't like the office temperature, didn't like the layout of the break room, and, as it turned out, didn't like the music. "I can't focus with this noise," she said one morning when she walked by David's desk. "Why can't we just have some peace and quiet?" David was surprised. He had always thought the music was a harmless distraction, something that made the office feel a little more human. But Megan's complaint didn't stop at David's desk. It spread to HR, who, after several weeks of back-and-forth discussions, decided to remove the music entirely. David couldn't believe it. The change was subtle at first, but soon the absence of the familiar tunes became glaringly obvious. The office felt quieter, emptier. Without the background music, the energy of the place drained away, and employees started complaining about the sudden shift in atmosphere. The once vibrant hum of productivity was replaced by a stifling silence, making the long hours feel even longer. It didn't take long for others to join in their complaints. "It's so dead in here now," one of David's coworkers, Sarah, remarked. "We used to have something to make the day go by faster, but it was too late. The music was gone, and the office was quieter than ever." David reflected on how one person's complaint had led to a significant change in the entire workplace environment. Megan's dislike of a harmless, inconsequential part of the office had, in a way, robbed everyone of something small but meaningful. What had been an enjoyable routine for most had been taken away because of one person's discontent. Casual Fridays had always been a highlight of the week. After a long week of wearing business casual attire, the prospect of dressing down on Friday was something everyone looked forward to. Employees were free to wear jeans, t-shirts, and even sneakers. It was a way to unwind and show that, despite the rigid demands of the corporate world, there was room for personal expression. But for one employee, things took a turn for the worse when she showed up on a casual Friday wearing workout clothes. Her name was Lisa, and while she was an otherwise competent worker, her choice of attire that day sparked an unexpected chain of events. Lisa had come into the office wearing a pair of baggy sweatpants and a loose tank top, clearly more suited for a gym than a professional setting. While most people wouldn't have given it a second thought, a few of her colleagues did. As the morning wore on, whispers started circulating about her inappropriate choice of attire. "Isn't she taking casual Friday a bit too far?" Someone asked in the break room. It's supposed to be casual, not like we just roll out of bed. Soon, the complaints made their way to management and the HR department was forced to intervene. They called Lisa in for a discussion about appropriate workplace attire, explaining that while casual Fridays were meant to allow employees to relax, there were still limits to what was acceptable. Lisa, embarrassed and defensive, insisted that she had simply misunderstood the guidelines. But the damage was done. Rather than addressing the situation with Lisa directly, the company decided to cancel casual Fridays altogether. It was a swift and harsh decision, one that left many employees frustrated. David, who had always looked forward to the relaxed atmosphere on Fridays, felt the sting of the decision. He had never met Lisa personally, but he couldn't help but feel that her one choice of clothing had resulted in a policy change that affected everyone. It was as if one person's actions, though unintentional, had led to the loss of a small but significant perk for everyone else in the office. The sudden cancellation of casual Fridays left a sour taste in the mouths of the employees. The office felt less personal, more rigid. The small things that had once made the workplace feel more comfortable had been taken away, all because of one employee's misunderstanding. David couldn't help but wonder what would be next. How many more of these small things, small privileges, could be taken away before the office felt completely devoid of any personal touch? It had only been a few months since David had started working at the company, and already, he was seeing how quickly things could change. It was the small things, really, things people took for granted, that were being stripped away one by one. The loss of casual Fridays, the silence in the office after the music was turned off, the absence of boots in the uniform package, and the restrictive policies that follow one person's selfishness, it all seemed to add up. David couldn't shake the feeling that the workplace was becoming a shell of its former self. What had once been a place where employees could look forward to a few perks, where small things made the daily grind bearable, was now just another corporate environment devoid of the little joys that had made it unique. The perks had been taken away, and in their place was a culture of suspicion and restraint. The atmosphere in the office was thick with tension. It wasn't just the missing music or the canceled casual Fridays. It was the general sense that no one could trust anyone else to do the right thing. The constant fear that one person's actions might result in a new policy that would negatively affect everyone else had created a pervasive atmosphere of resentment. David thought about how, in each of these cases, one person's actions had led to a loss. Whether it was the boots, the discount, or the music, it seemed that people couldn't be trusted to enjoy a simple privilege without ruining it for everyone else. The company had become less of a community and more of a collection of isolated individuals, each trying to avoid being the next person to ruin something for everyone. And yet, David couldn't help but wonder, could things ever go back to the way they were? Was it possible to rebuild the trust that had been lost? Or would the company continue to spiral into a place where no one felt comfortable, where even the smallest joys were snatched away? It was a Friday afternoon when David received an email from HR about a new policy. He opened it, his heart sinking as he read the details. New company policy, no personal items on desks. It seemed like an odd request, but as David read the reasoning, he understood. Apparently, one employee had been taking up too much space with personal decorations, photographs, plants, and knickknacks, and the company felt it was time to impose a policy to ensure the office looked more professional. David couldn't believe it. The small comforts that people had added to their workspace, photos of loved ones, a plant to brighten the room, a funny mug or two, were now forbidden. The email stated that all employees were required to clear their desks by the end of the day. Personal items had no place in a professional environment. David felt the weight of the decision settle on him. It was another small thing taken away, another piece of individuality erased from the workspace. One person's choice to overstep had led to the removal of a privilege that everyone had enjoyed. As the day wore on, he watched as his colleagues silently packed away their personal items, some reluctantly, others with a sense of quiet resignation. It wasn't just the policy that stung, it was the realization that the office had become a place where one person's actions could determine the fate of everyone else. David sat back in his chair, looking at the empty space where his small potted plant had once sat. The office no longer felt like a place of collaboration or camaraderie. It felt cold and sterile. The small moments that had once made the workplace feel human, personal touches, shared experiences, simple joys, had all been stripped away. And for what? To prevent one person from making the next mistake that would lead to more restrictions. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. There was no going back now. The days following the latest policy change were filled with a quiet, uncomfortable tension. The office that once had felt like a community where small moments of personal connection were shared amidst the chaos of deadlines had now become a place of sterile conformity. No personal items, no music. Casual Fridays were a distant memory. David had watched the impact unfold. The loss of small comforts hadn't just affected him, it was affecting everyone. The staff seemed more distant, less engaged. Colleagues who had once laughed and chatted during breaks now sat in silence, staring at their screens. The sense of camaraderie that had existed seemed to be slipping away, and David felt like he was watching the office transform into a lifeless machine. He tried to keep his own morale up, but it was getting harder. His desk, once decorated with family photos and a few quirky trinkets, now sat bare. The plant he had lovingly nurtured over the past year had been packed away. The little things that had made the office feel more human were gone. And with them, a part of him had gone too. David wasn't the only one feeling the shift. Sarah, who had once been the office cheerleader, trying to keep everyone's spirits up, was now withdrawn. Her vibrant personality had dimmed, and David noticed her spending more and more time at her desk, staring out the window instead of joining in the quiet conversations during lunch breaks. Even Jason, the office jokester, had lost his spark. He used to crack jokes in meetings, lightening the mood, but now he sat at the back of the room, quiet and serious. The absence of music and the canceled casual Fridays had dulled the light in the office, and no one seemed to know how to bring it back. David couldn't shake the feeling that something had broken in the culture of the company. The chain of events, triggered by a single individual's complaint or action, had set off a domino effect. One minor disruption had led to a series of policies that slowly stripped away everything that had made the office feel like a place where people could be themselves. The more these small things were taken away, the more the team became disconnected, both from each other and from the purpose of their work. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when things finally reached their breaking point. David arrived at the office to find a new announcement on the board in the lobby. This time, the policy change was about the office dress code. New policy: no non-business related conversations during office hours. The note from HR explained that while employees were free to talk, any conversation not related to work would be considered a distraction. Apparently, someone had complained about the amount of chit-chat in the office, feeling that it was too noisy and disruptive. As a result, employees were now prohibited from talking about personal matters during work hours unless it was directly related to the tasks at hand. David stared at the note, disbelief spreading through him. The idea that casual conversations, those moments of connection that had once bonded the team together, were now considered a distraction felt absurd. He couldn't help but feel like the company was squeezing the last bit of life out of the workplace. It was no longer a place to work, it had become a place to simply go through the motions. The decision was the final straw for David. He could feel his own sense of frustration bubbling up. He wasn't alone. The entire office seemed to be collectively holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to change. But instead, things just got tighter. The invisible walls that had started to form around the employees now felt like a cage. David grabbed his coffee, his mind racing. He couldn't stay in an environment like this any longer, not when every small piece of individuality was being ripped away. He needed a change. After a few days of quiet reflection, he made a decision. David sat down at his desk and drafted a resignation letter. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only choice he felt he had left. He needed to find a place where the work culture didn't stifle individuality, where the small things, the personal touches, could still exist. David's decision spread quickly through the office. When he handed in his resignation to HR, the looks on his colleagues' faces said it all. They weren't surprised. Many of them had been feeling the same way. They had all watched the company slowly shift, and David was the first to make the move. Others had quietly been considering the same thing, but none had acted yet. Jason came over to David's desk later that day. "You really going through with it?" he asked, his voice low. David nodded, feeling a sense of liberation mixed with sadness. "I have to. I can't keep working in an environment where everything that made the place human is being taken away. It's not even about the perks anymore, it's about the culture. It's just not the same anymore." Jason gave a slow nod, understanding more than words could express. "Yeah, it's like they're trying to make us all the same. I can't stand it either." David smiled faintly. It was a good run, but sometimes you have to leave before it breaks you. That evening, Sarah approached him in the break room. She had heard the news, and though she had always been the one to encourage the team, she looked tired. Her usual upbeat energy was gone. "David," she began softly, "are you sure this is the right move?" He paused for a moment. "I think it is. I've been thinking about it for a while. I can't be part of a place where every little thing is being taken away. I don't feel like myself here anymore." Sarah let out a sigh, her shoulders sagging. "I know exactly what you mean. I've been feeling the same way. I think a lot of us have. But none of us have had the courage to leave yet." David nodded. "Sometimes you have to take the leap, even if it feels scary." Sarah didn't say anything else, but the understanding between them was clear. It was a silent acknowledgement of the struggle they all faced, trying to navigate a workplace that was slowly stripping away everything that made it feel like home. David handed in his resignation letter the next morning. His last day at the office was bittersweet. As he packed his things, he couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sorrow. He would miss his colleagues, the ones who had shared in the quiet, subtle joys of office life, but he couldn't stay in a place where those joys were being slowly erased. When the clock hit 5 p.m. on his last day, David walked out of the building, the doors closing behind him. He didn't look back. Over the next few months, David found a new job in a company that valued work-life balance, personal expression, and individuality. The contrast was striking. At his new job, casual Fridays were still in place, music played in the background, and personal items were welcomed in the workspace. People laughed, talked, and shared stories over lunch. There was no strict control over conversations or personal expression. As he settled into his new role, David realized that sometimes the small things, those little touches of individuality and personal connection, are what make all the difference. In the end, it wasn't about the big salary or the prestige of the company. It was about finding a place where he could be himself, where the culture didn't just focus on productivity but on people. He smiled as he sat at his desk, the small plant he had bought for the office sitting proudly next to his computer. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first step toward reclaiming the workplace as a space where everyone could thrive, not just as employees, but as human beings. David had learned a valuable lesson. When you're in an environment that slowly erases who you are, it's time to leave. And when you find a place that celebrates who you are, that's where you stay.